Hello there, it is another Tuesday, which of course means it's time for another in real life video. And this week, first, let's begin by apologizing, as we have done in all the other videos most recently, so we'll try and keep it brief. But we had to skip last week's unexpectedly due to family emergency, had to go get a family member to the ER and accompany them in their aftercare at the hospital and all of that. I can't really talk about too much more out of respect for their privacy, but nonetheless, things are doing better now. Anyway, without further ado, let us go on to the main topic, which is something a little bit more topical. If you've been paying attention to video games news, or especially news surrounding the Elder Scrolls, you will know that a lot of people think that we now know the name of the Elder Scrolls 6, and it is entirely within the realm of possibility that this is 100% correct, right? It is Sentinel. A lot of people are thinking that it's going to be Sentinel. I've heard a few folks talk about this, that it just sounds like a bit of a weird name because Sentinel is kind of just a regular English word. It's not something along the lines of Morrowind or Skyrim, but it is something along the lines of Arena or Oblivion, which are also just English words, which even amongst those two don't always have search engine optimization prioritization, SEO prioritization. There was that Tom Cruise movie by the name of Oblivion that sometimes shows up if you just type in Oblivion. Sometimes you get that movie rather than the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion or a remaster or whatever. Thus, I feel like that's kind of a moot point. I feel like the franchise, the Elder Scrolls IP, is big enough. It's at a point now to where those sorts of considerations we can just remove ourselves from, because I feel like it's so big that it kind of creates its own destiny. It kind of creates, well, it creates its own prophecy. It creates a name for itself, right? It doesn't need to rely on a catchy naming schema. You know, I think it will survive on its own if the game is good, or even if it's bad. I feel like it's still going to sell a whole lot, right? Regardless, a lot of people think it is the Elder Scrolls 6 Sentinel. The main reason for this is, first and foremost, on Twitter, Asha Sharma, who we've talked here about in recent times as well, was speaking about playing an early version of the Elder Scrolls 6 and used asterisks to sort of censor the game subtitle. And the number of asterisks aligns with the number of characters in the name Sentinel, right? The city in Hammerfell, the capital of Hammerfell, Sentinel. The amount of characters matches up, and also in some ways corroborating that it's not just a coincidence, the number of characters used in the title. I believe it was the official Bethesda Game Studios Twitter account replied using the same number of asterisks, right? Which, like I said, once again, aligns with Sentinel. Other things started to come into the fray corroborating this. Obviously, Hammerfell is a location that folks have long thought would be the next one, especially given Hammerfell's role during the conflict within Tamriel involving the Third Aldmeri Dominion. It makes a lot of sense. There's already a lot of narrative through lines to connect between Skyrim to Hammerfell, to Sentinel, which would be, like we had said, the capital of that land, of that province. But even removed from that, I feel like it's a relatively sensible one if they decide to not continue directly the Third Aldmeri Dominion storyline and all of that from Skyrim. If they decide to pivot to something else, I feel like either way, Hammerfell is ripe for it. There's other things corroborating this information as well. Jez Corden sort of, I would describe as relatively nice guy, but somewhat unreliable insider. In the past, I'm not sure about his track record with anything related to Bethesda Game Studios or anything like under the umbrella of now Microsoft, the corporate entity of Microsoft. But I do want to point out that although he does have like connections and stuff, he has been wrong in the past. I've seen some folks saying that Jez Corden is like an infallible insider. This is not true. Think back not too long ago to a mysterious statue appearing in the desert. That's right. Remember the weird statue in the desert that appeared just before the Game Awards and would eventually come to be a tie-in to the announcement at the Game Awards for Larian's next game, Divinity, where the statue was featured in their like big cinematic teaser trailer. Jez Corden, before we knew all of that, I went and double-checked this just to be sure, was on record saying that statue was Diablo 4, but also more. Something almost exactly along those lines. And of course, we know it wasn't. Diablo 4, I think, was there at the Game Awards, but it had nothing to do with that statue, right? Thus, Jez Corden seems like a nice enough dude, right? So far seems like a nice enough guy, but let's take it easy with taking his word as complete gospel. He's not infallible. Obviously, this could be from a very different source that he's getting this information. And like we had said, for a lot of folks, it makes sense. It adds up, right? But I do want to be like, take it with a grain of salt, what Jez Corden is saying here. I feel like maybe more convincing is all of this working in tandem, all of this information coming together at once. Another bit of information that in some ways people are thinking corroborates the information that this will be the Elder Scrolls 6 Sentinel is that in Starfield, at the beginning of Starfield, I'm one of the few Starfield enjoyers. I still put out a damn Starfield video. I try to do it every week on Sunday. At the start of Starfield, when you're making your character for the first time, only for the first time, I believe, you have an employee ID number or an employee classification ID, some sort of employee number associated with your character because you're working for Argos Mining, right? I believe that is. But at the bottom left of that character creator is that number. And it's a whole bunch of characters, but I believe, is it hexadecimal? I can't remember what it was, but a while back, some intrepid Starfield enjoyers of yore cracked this code and saw that it spelled out Sentinel. This isn't new information. This has been around for a while and people knew about this. We're going to talk a little bit about Starfield spoilers here if you care. But originally, what was believed, and I still think this is probably the case, but it may also serve as like a secondary or like auxiliary meaning behind it. There may be like another meaning behind this word. But if you run it through whatever cipher it was, I forget exactly what the cipher was, my apologies. But you run this code, these numbers through it. I believe it's 16 numbers, and you run them together in groups of 2. You get 8 characters, and it spells out Sentinel. Which, hey, is pretty wild. So within the purview of Starfield, for the longest time, a lot of us all thought, and like I said, I still think this to be true. We're entering spoiler territory. In Starfield, you eventually become Starborn, right? Which is this sort of concept where humans begin to ascend and get all of these weird, like, sci-fi powers, not unlike the Force or other sort of bits of science fiction where people have, like, cosmic power. And all of the Starborn that you meet in the game, because this is like a story about exploration and like humanity and sort of whether you retain or lose your humanity in such a way, and the interest that humans have with exploration itself and how it wanes, or they find it boring and decide to not do it despite having like a wealth of opportunity in front of them. They sort of go back and return to petty conflict. This is sort of like the main themes at present in Starfield. All of these Starborn individuals, all of these Starborn humans who have ascended in this way, they all have a title. There's ones that are like the Hunter or the Emissary. There's no shortage of them. The Hunter and the Emissary are probably the two foremost ones that you'll meet and recognize. But regardless, a lot of folks figured that this means that the game was rigged from the start. That indeed your player ID number, your minor employee number ID at Argos Mining, was alluding to the fact that this would be the player character's title. Oftentimes in Starfield, in like press releases, and certainly in the community now, myself included, refer to the protagonist of Starfield as the Spacefarer. But this is sort of like a what we were going by before the revelation and knowledge that like, oh, our player character would become Starborn, right? You would get this cosmic power. But it does seem like the Sentinel would be the player character's title after that like pivotal story moment in Starfield, that you would be the Sentinel in the same way that there is the Emissary, the Hunter, right? But once again, the two are not like mutually exclusive. You can have both. It could be that the Starfield protagonist is the Sentinel. Their Starborn title is the Sentinel. And similarly, they could have chosen the Sentinel because their next game would be titled Sentinel, right? It makes a lot of sense in that way, right? It doesn't disprove it one way or the other. I feel like, once again, to reiterate, all of these things working together in tandem, I feel make me a bit of a believer, right? I'm down for it. And like we had said before, it being set in Hammerfell is something that a whole lot of people have thought for a while. Like we had said, there's so many narrative threads in Skyrim that tie over to Hammerfell. It's probably the province other than Cyrodiil that has the most narrative connective tissue, you know? Yeah, I would say. Also, of interest and of note, we have heard rumors. I don't believe it's anything confirmed or solid. But we have heard rumor and scuttlebutt that Elder Scrolls 6 would have some sort of sailing mechanic. I don't remember if we know if this is 100% locked in, but that there would be some sort of like vehicle, like sea sailing aspect to the game. And it would probably build off of the shipbuilding and like ship piloting, captaining system that exists in Starfield, right? Maybe your sailing ship isn't quite as modular as what you can get in Starfield, where you're like building a starship like piece by piece, you know, but more so, oh, you can change out like the sails, you can put in new cannons and stuff, change the type of hull, change the size of the ship, right? Maybe a bit similar to that, but a bit more confined. Think along the lines of, I would say, the difference between settlement building in Fallout 4 versus outpost building in Starfield, or even like, working on a Hearthfire home in Skyrim. Obviously, Fallout 4's situation with its settlement building is a lot more robust than either of those two. It's a bit more of the focus of the game. There's the whole scrap economy and weapon modding and armor modding and all of that stuff. It may well be that they keep that sort of there at the forefront, right? So thus, I could see it as well. And Sentinel, of course, being based in Hammerfell, Red Guards of Hammerfell. Hammerfell has a very like maritime sort of vibe to it. Not all of it, but there is a big aspect to like Red Guards being known as being like swashbucklers in a sense, you know, being very seafaring, right? Look no further than like in the Oblivion remaster in Anvil, right? Which sort of has the most cultural touchstones with Hammerfell in Anvil, in Cyrodiil. You get a lot of that. Thus, it would make sense that if there's a game which features like seafaring, it would be predominantly, or at least initially, set in Hammerfell, maybe pivoting around Sentinel. Maybe you start in Sentinel, or maybe Sentinel is like the end goal, where it's like under the occupation of the Third Aldmeri Dominion, and you sort of work around it in like a Breath of the Wild style move, where you're sailing around Hammerfell, the islands out in the Abetian Sea, I believe. Probably not so far as Somerset Isles. I figure if they do Somerset Isles, that would make for a good like expansion if they wanted to do a big one. But there's also been people thinking, myself included, that the next Elder Scrolls game will not just be one province, but more than one. Probably two. And the other one that would make sense to include here would be, at least at launch, right? Maybe they do Somerset Isles as a big super duper sized expansion. But the other one that makes sense to include at launch, I think, is obviously High Rock, right? Just north of Hammerfell, which is the area, not in totality, but predominantly featured in Daggerfall. It's the land of Bretons and a little bit of orcs, where you have the Rothgarian Highlands and stuff. You get a lot of interesting culture clash there. But yeah, all of that being under occupation by the Third Aldmeri Dominion in some form or another makes sense, right? And sort of having it pivot around the city of Sentinel as well makes a lot of sense. And being able to sail back and forth between these areas, because between Hammerfell and High Rock, there's a lot of coastline and a lot of opportunities for, even if you go look at like older maps, there's plenty of islands sort of off the coast in the Abetian Sea before you even get to the Somerset Isles. You know, there's like a midway point where there's islands out there, which would make for fun and wonderful exploration by sea. You know, I think it's ripe with opportunity for that. And like I said, just going along the coastline, and who knows what else they decide to put out there. There could be some sort of like weird Elder Scrolls-esque catastrophe that creates a new landmass out there, which I'm not saying volcano, but, you know, something could pop up out of the sky and blast into the ocean. There could be a whole bunch of weird stuff out in the water, you know? It's 100% within the realm of possibility. Would be super cool. Either way, regardless, I'm on board with it. I'm on board with it being Sentinel, but at the same time, you know, I'm open to it being something else. But I'm very convinced that it could be Sentinel. I'm super on board with it. I think it sounds good. It looks fun. It's, you know, it's been something that people have been thinking about for a while. It makes so much sense. Not to reiterate again, but there's a lot of narrative through line between the events of Skyrim to things going on in Hammerfell in particular. It makes so much sense. And if you were worried, perhaps, which now being a public part of now with Bethesda Game Studios being part of a publicly traded company, they may be worried about reception because now they have to deal with investors. They're not privately owned. Also, you know, the stakes when it comes to making the Elder Scrolls 6 have never been higher, right? It feels like so much is resting on their shoulders when it comes to getting this game out and it being a success. It's ridiculous. Like, the amount of stress involved could not be higher. I feel like I don't really know what else you could do to up the ante on that, like, pressure cooker, as it were, right? To make that more of a high pressure zone for the idea of like developing the Elder Scrolls 6. I feel like I'm hard pressed to think of more things you could do aside from like, oh, you need to do this, make this game good. Otherwise there's going to be, we're going to kill people in real life, right? I don't know how else you raise the stakes on making this more high pressure than it already is. But to sort of alleviate some of that pressure and worry about, oh, we're setting it in Hammerfell, which has all of this, all of the sort of like cultural influences of Redguards being very like maritime, swashbuckling, sort of Middle Eastern themes, some like African stuff thrown in as well. That sort of amalgamation that Elder Scrolls is famous for, where it's like you blend together a bunch of stuff in a fun and interesting way. If you do want to like quell those concerns and maybe dial in a little bit to the successes of Game of Thrones, which you always hear people say that Skyrim took a lot of nods from Game of Thrones, in particular the TV show, which would be when it was at like the cultural forefront, would be the TV show rather than the books. In the same way that Oblivion was highly informed by the successes of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I don't think that's Skyrim because the timeline doesn't match up. I feel like the height of popularity for Game of Thrones doesn't quite match up with Skyrim. But I think that there's opportunity for it there in Elder Scrolls 6, right? And I think you can get some of them more like, what would you even call it? Like European fantasy, like Western fantasy, where it's like, regular sword and sorcery, castles and stuff, right? More generic stuff. You get a lot of that in High Rock, right? High Rock is kind of known for that, more so than Cyrodiil, which ideally is like a petri dish, like a mixing pot, a melting pot, if you will, combined with like a lot of Roman stuff on top. It's really, you get into a lot of like Francophone castles, right? Like French chateaus and stuff with High Rock, because Bretons are very like French informed, not exclusively, right? There's more like English stuff in there as well, but it predominantly, I believe, they're very Francophone. But of course, in France, you got castles, right? You got these great castles. You got these little like hamlets and such. I don't know if they're exactly hamlets. I forgot what they're called. But you have all of that sort of, all of those like cultural touchstones to pull from if you wanted to do stuff in High Rock. You get cool stuff involving like Wayrest and all that stuff too. I think that's a strong possibility if we go that route, and I think that's indicative of why they would call it Sentinel rather than Hammerfell, right? Because the city is either the beginning point or the end point, or it's the focal point, right? The city of Sentinel is in some way pivotal, not unlike the Imperial City being a bit of a pivotal area in greater Elder Scrolls lore, but at least for the story of the Elder Scrolls 6 and perhaps this phase of the fallout of the conflict with the Third Aldmeri Dominion, it may pivot around, this next phase may pivot around Sentinel, right? As sort of a launching point before we head straight into Alinor, right? Which could be an expansion, or that could be like Elder Scrolls 7. Right, we know for a fact that Microsoft is wanting them to really pump this stuff out, right? Thus, maybe Elder Scrolls 7 isn't that far off. Who can say? Either way, I'm really on board with it being Sentinel. It makes a lot of sense to me. You could add no shortage of like as well if you want like an expansion that's a throwback. If we're doing Sentinel and it's a combo, because of course Sentinel is sort of like on the interior coast. I forget the name of that inland sea, right? But you sort of have High Rock, which is a bit of like this Z or S-shaped peninsula to the north, and then Hammerfell beneath it. And Sentinel is kind of positioned in the middle, where there's like, I don't know, this like gulf? Is it a gulf? I don't think it's a gulf. But either way, that body of water there, it's kind of right between the two of those provinces. Obviously, it's in Hammerfell, but between the two of them. But if you wanted to have like a throwback DLC, you could go in either direction as well. You could be like, oh, you're going to this section of Skyrim, right? You could go over to Solitude, which is around the northeastern coast of Skyrim. You could go to Anvil as well. You could have a return DLC to go back to Anvil. Makes a lot of sense to do that. Maybe insofar as going to like Kvatch, that would be cool to see a canon rebuilt version of Kvatch after the events of Oblivion. And if anything, I'm selling myself more on there being a throwback DLC to go to like the eastern end of Cyrodiil, or the western end of Cyrodiil, my bad. To see like Anvil, maybe oh my gosh. What is it? The big vampire-y one. Oh my gosh, how I'm completely blanking on it. How am I getting all of these names until now? Like my favorite town in all of Oblivion, perhaps. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on it. You know, the one where Count Hasseldor lives. What the fuck is the name of it? Either way, you could maybe go so far inland as there. Probably not to the Imperial City, right? But you could hang out around there, have a throwback DLC. It makes a lot of sense to do that because we just had the remaster. It's in a lot of people's minds. There's people who maybe didn't play Oblivion originally who have now played it, who now, if you do a throwback DLC, it'll hit maybe not as hard for them to go back to that area, but it'll still hit a little bit, you know? Not unlike how Skyrim had the going back to Morrowind through Solstheim, which had traded like borders and all of that. That was sort of like a treat for those people. I say those people, I am those people. Either way, I think it's ripe, full of potential, full of possibilities. It makes a lot of sense, you know. Still take everything with a grain of salt, but I feel like, you know, I feel like it's a reasonable bet. Right? I feel like it's a reasonable bet. But at the same time, I feel like the more tame response is that, well, we kind of already figured that this would be the case, you know? Maybe all of this was just like a press move. I've heard some people say that this is like a press move to sort of like tame people, tame public opinion a bit following the nightmarish layoffs and all of that, because we're just a little bit farther removed from all the layoffs to where it's like, okay, don't worry about the layoffs. How about this little treat, right? Elder Scrolls, huh? Guess what? I played a little bit of it. Oh, how many characters are in the subtitle for it, right? Oh, it could be Sentinel, right? Regardless, seems like a solid bet. Seems like a solid bet. I wouldn't 100% lock in on it, but it seems like a solid bet. All right, that ought to do it for this week. A topical one, like I said. Until next time, please take care of each other.